Hello everyone. This video is going to be like an add-on to the previous video where we were talking about the bit 8 and digital distortion in general. And at the beginning of the video, I made a bit of an irresponsible comment where I said, well, nowadays working in the DAW, you don't really have to worry about digital distortion. It's more just an effect that you add on to a signal if you want that kind of a sound. And I had a bad dream. It was involved in the dream, so I figured I better just make this video where we talk about gain staging and just working with digital audio. Now, all the stuff I'm going to say, it's true regardless of the DAW that you're working in. So of course, we're going to do it in Bitwig, but for anybody, this is useful if you don't already know it. I think most of it is just common sense though. So when you're working, your common sense indicator kind of goes up on your brain and you kind of realize when you are digitally distorting, but that's besides the point. Let's get into the how and the why. So first things first that I just want to show you is that when we go into our settings and we go to audio, we have our little sample rate option selector here. You may have more options, you may have less. It depends on your interface. And other factors, but you can see that the lowest setting we have is 44,100 hertz. And we talked about the Nyquist theorem a little bit, which basically states if you want full fidelity of a signal, you want to sample it at twice that value, at twice the highest value that you want to try to capture clearly or capture cleanly. And our hearing range is roughly 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. So if we follow that theorem, we need to make sure that if we're capturing clean fidelity audio, at least in the human hearing range, that it's above 20,000. And so we have to sample at twice that, and then there's a little bit of an added buffer in there, so we get approximately 44,000. We cannot select anything lower than that, which means when we're recording in our DAW, we cannot get digital distortion errors as it relates to the frequency spectrum. We just can't do it, okay? It may not sound super hi-fi or whatever, but there's not gonna be those sorts of errors in the signal. The only time when that may happen would be if for some reason you brought in a sample that had been sampled, had been recorded at something below 40,000 hertz, which is going to be extremely rare, if not impossible. It will probably never happen when you're working in the computer. People may have added some bit crushing after the fact, but just bringing that sample in, it's almost always going to at least say 44.1 when you look at the data of that sample. Okay, so that's the first thing. So what that tells me is, as far as it relates to sample rate, we really can't do that. We can't do that by mistake. But the place we can have mistakes occur is in the amplitude spectrum. Okay, in the digital domain, your brick wall is 0, and then we go backwards, right? We've seen that a million times when we're working in the DAW. You already know how that works for the most part. Now, here's where things get really interesting though. We're gonna do a few examples. I'm gonna bring up a test tone here. And I'm going to try to keep the volume to 0 the whole time so you guys don't have your ears blown out. When I go and I crank these settings up, gain to 0, mix to 100%, we're expecting that on this fader here, we are right at 0. This means no distortion is occurring. If we were to add gain anywhere along the path, we would be going over 0, and I will show you what that means here. So at 0, if I go in here and I bounce this clip out, post fader is fine in this case, 24-bit is fine. When we look at the resulting audio that occurs, we will see our still nice and smooth sine wave, okay? No distortion is occurring at all, but we are right at the limit. The second we go over that limit, it literally just lops it off and it produces an error. And it's an audible error, right? You've all heard it. We heard it in the previous video. So I'll at least let you see what it looks like. So we'll go in this time and we're gonna grab our tool device, okay? And we're gonna increase the amplitude here. So we bring the amplitude up. We are now going over by roughly 4.8 dB. And we're gonna see that on our indicator here. We're gonna see it on our indicator here when we're looking at the master. Now, if I didn't have this muted, we would actually see this fader as red, but this fader will not be red. Okay, it's going to tell us the amount that we've gone over 0, but technically we can still save it. Technically on this channel, it's not really distorting. It's only distorting at that final output, at where it's being summed. And that's what you're hearing. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes you may have a big project and none of your faders are actually clipping, right? None of the channels are clipping, but the master is clipping. And it may not even sound that bad. And to be honest, a lot of people work that way. It's not the end of the world. And we can actually still save the audio completely if we don't want those errors. And we'll talk about that as we go on. But let's go ahead and bounce it now. And again, we're going to stay at 24-bit. And this time, let's go ahead and take a look at this signal. And instead of seeing that smooth sine wave, we're going to get the indicator of something that appears to be squaring out a little bit. And that is your distortion. And now, and this is the question, if you're following along, on the master, if we solo this and we play it, okay, what is it going to look like on the master track? That's the big question. Okay, so let's go ahead here and let's play it back. And on the master, we should expect it to read out at 0. And the reason for that is when we bounce that clip at 24-bit depth, there's nothing higher than 0. It's just the distortion. So it's still going to come out at 0 dB. Okay, but the distortion is now inherent to this audio file, and there's no saving it. There's no way that we can pull the gain back down and get our sine wave back to its original nice curvy form. And obviously in real life, we're talking about much more complex audio signals. This is just so you can visualize it. Now here's where things get really interesting, and partly why on this channel here, we can still read out the value that's over 0. And that's because we're working at floating point bit depth, where even when we go over 0, it's smart enough to where, like, if we adjust the gain somewhere, we can actually save it. So let's get rid of these two, and I'll just demonstrate that for you guys here. And let's go way over. Let's go like 20 over, okay? Something insane. All right, and we're gonna do 2 examples. So I need to unmute this actually so that it can export it. So we are going to bounce, and we're gonna choose post fader, doesn't matter. One example is gonna be at 24-bit. And the other example is going to be at 32-bit floating point depth. Okay, 32. It will usually take a little bit longer to do the 32 one. So we have 32 float. Okay, and now this is where it gets really interesting. So now if we solo out the 24, we should expect a 0 down here. It might show it as going plus 20 for a second, but then it's going to recover back. Okay, so we see the 0. Now, here's the kicker to this whole experiment, and what's so important is that on the 32-bit floating point depth, we are going to still see it in the red. And what that means is we can save this clip. We can actually bring it back to full fidelity. We look at it right now, you can see that it's super squared out, but at any point now along this chain, and we're going to get to this in a little bit when we're talking more specifically about gain staging, I can save this file. I can bring it back. Okay, on the master, we're still going to see that it's clipping at that value. So let's bring in a tool device here. And I believe we were clipping by roughly 20. So we're going to bring this down 20 until we see that we're not getting any readout in the red. All right, now here comes the fascinating part. When I go and I bounce this, and let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to go back to 24-bit. Click OK. Let's take a look. And what we should expect to see is that sine wave recovered. And we see that like so. Okay, and this is fundamentally what you need to understand about how clipping works in the DAW. With that 24-bit example, if I go in and I do the same thing, and I bring it down by 20, it's not going to matter. We're going to see that the wave shape hasn't changed at all. So let's go ahead and let's bounce that, keeping it in 24-bit. And it wouldn't matter if we went out in 32-bit, okay? It's still going to show us that same wave shape. When we zoom in nice and close, we can still see that there's a square to it. And I'm just going to actually go in here and bring the gain back up just so you can see that. We're still getting that same squaring off effect. Okay, so that's the first thing that you just need to conceptually understand. And the other part to it as well that's so crazy is that it doesn't matter where we turn it down from. We could turn it down from the fader. It could be somewhere in the channel. It could be in the clip itself. We can save the 32-bit floating point stuff. And when you're actually working and you're actually using processors and plugins and devices, those are all working at 32-bit floating point depth unless you hear or read otherwise. Okay, and that's really the important part, because a lot of times you might be working and you might clip the master fader, but all of your channels are okay. So the question would be, if you took the master fader, and this was always a big no-no, well, it still is considered a big no-no, but if you take this and you bring it down to get out of the red on the master, you are okay. You are saving any kind of distortion that has happened there. All right, because all your channels are fine. So you're just making an adjustment here on the master track. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna pause the video quickly. We'll come back. We're gonna talk a little bit about gain staging and analog gain staging versus digital gain staging. Now we actually get to get into some of the fun stuff. I think anybody who was taught digital audio workstations and digital audio back in like the 2007 to 2010 or 2012 range was always taught that as soon as you open up a project on the master track, you had better put a peak limiter there. And they never really explained why, but basically the reason why I think, they're telling you to do this is to save yourself from a big mistake. So when you're first learning and you don't really know all of your devices, it's very easy that you might create a feedback loop. You might accidentally turn the wrong knob, and the next thing you know, the signal is getting really, really loud, and it's really clipping hard, and you could potentially damage your speakers if you're outputting on speakers, or blow up your headphones or something, have that driver just explode. Now, the problem is so many people were taught to do this and not really necessarily told why, and this isn't even a problem, this is just part of an overall sound aesthetic, that people would go on and they would start with a peak limiter. And as they were making their track, they really just wouldn't even think about the master because they never see the master going red, especially if you were to go in here and change your ceiling to like, let's say -0.2. You are never going to then end up seeing this go into the red. And so you're going to assume everything is okay. But like midway through the process of making your track, you look on the master track and you see, holy crap, I'm doing a ton of limiting. And you're actually doing the limiting effect, like you are actually limiting the audio signal that's coming in, and that produces a different type of sound. And so you're working with it and you don't realize you're limiting it so hard, and every decision you're then making moving forward is a decision you're making because you're hearing that peak limiter working on the back end, on your master channel. And once that happens, you really can't take off that peak limiter. You have to leave it on there. You can't bounce out all your tracks and then attempt to like recreate the same thing. It's just not gonna happen. So it's a kind of a dangerous strategy, but some people are used to doing that, and some people do it on purpose. And there's nothing wrong with doing that on purpose. It's just you have to realize that if this thing is really working and you don't want it to be working, you're going to have a hard time not making adjustments because of that. And I hope that that makes some sense. And let's just look really quickly at the difference. So let's go ahead. On this track first, we'll bounce out our sine wave again. Okay, pre or post fader in this case doesn't matter. And we are going to see that aggressive squaring out. Now, what happens if we bounce out the master channel where we have the peak limiter on? All right, we have to make sure we choose pre-fader in this example. Click OK. Let's take a look at this. And what we're going to see is the impact of the peak limiter. So it's trying its very best to keep that smooth sine wave, but it's being pushed in so hard that it is making a difference and it is causing distortion. It's just now more emulating a harmonic distortion versus a true digital error. You can still see that our peak has tried to stay more or less the same. And if we were listening, we would hear the effect of that, but I just don't think it's worth it. Given what we're doing. So that is the next thing that you really have to understand. And now we're going to start to talk a little bit more about that whole analog concept and how you emulate that in the DAW with your gain stage. If anyone is curious, gain staging just refers to following an audio signal's path from the moment it comes in till the moment it's being output on the master channel, and following it and tracking the gain of that signal every step along the way. Now, in this example, we just have our phase 4 instrument, okay? So we've brought that in. And with the phase 4, we have a variety of different gain stages just inside of this instrument. We have a drive into the filter, Okay, our filter isn't even on right now, but if I drive into it and we're gonna use, I don't want to talk about this output, but this is our clean output. This is our pure digital output right here. So when I crank it up, unless we get to that point where we cross over 0, the signal is untouched. Okay, there's no additional harmonics being brought in. There's no kind of distortion. This is just a clean gain, okay, on the output of the instrument. Inside of the instrument, at the filter stage, we have a drive control. If we overdrive the filter, we are going to start to hear a distortion there. You can hear that. That is no longer a clean sine wave, even though we are not distorting anywhere else in the signal. Okay, in the analog domain, there's not that concept of a hard 0, of a brick wall 0. Basically what happens in the analog domain is there's kind of a recommended idea of like what a clean output is. Too quiet, you hear too much of the noise of the analog, whatever the devices you're using, whether it's a tape machine, vinyl, cassette, what have you, you'll hear that noise. If you get too low. If you get too loud, you go beyond the point that it can record cleanly and you get more of like an analog distortion, more of like an analog cleaner clipping. And that's what we're hearing here with the filter. This isn't a digital distortion. This is really an analog distortion, bringing on overtones that are related to the fundamental, that are related to the signal. And that's what people often associate with analog and why it's supposedly, so much better than digital. But of course, now in the digital domain, we can emulate this stuff. It's an emulation, obviously. It's not the real thing, but it more or less is doing the same thing. Now, after the filter drive, we have another drive. This is supposed to basically be this control right here. They call it the voice gain, but it's essentially like your output of the instrument going into some kind of an amplifier, okay? And it's supposed to be a clean one. But what we will hear now, if we drive up here and it starts to go red, we are getting another distortion characteristic. And then we have our clean gain, that as we adjust that, and you can see it on the output here, okay, the signal's no longer changing color at all. We can get really aggressive if we want to. Now, once this goes out of the red here, we essentially have a pure clean sine wave again. So you almost imagine that this output is on the outside of the instrument, this output is on the inside of the instrument, this output is related specifically to a filter, another amplifier involving the filter right there. Okay, and that's important to understand just because even in something like an instrument like this in Bitwig, it's trying to emulate for you what it's like in analog. Now, if all of our effects are digital, what we're expecting when we go into that, like let's say we bring in the EQ, for example. Let's bring in Bitwig's EQ. Okay, EQ 5 is fine. All right, we have an output gain here. But again, this output gain is intended to be totally clean. When we drive this output, the only time we're gonna get additional distortion is gonna be if we go over like 0, and then it becomes that digital distortion that we don't want. But plenty of EQs and plenty of other effects are actually based on analog. So like if I go, and I'm gonna mute this, okay, we have now gone over. We are now digitally clipping. We're not going to actually see that in here, I don't believe, but we would be able to hear it. Now, the crazy part about this is at any other point along the signal chain, even to this output stage here, I can compensate for it and I can save it. Let me just make sure we have that peak limiter on just so you can hear it. It actually still sounds really clean, but I can even compensate for it here. And I can essentially save the signal, okay, and remove any of that clipping because we're working at 32-bit floating point depth. Now, again, this isn't always true when you're working with analog modeled plugins, and this is why gain staging does matter, and something that people don't always understand. So let's bring in something that's a little bit more analog inspired. So the last thing we're going to do is just look at a plugin that's capable of both operating in like a purely digital fashion and then also operating more in terms of analog, at least as saturation is concerned. So right now with this plugin, with this set to linear and it's set to no EQ saturation on, if we were to drive through this, and again, this is kind of crazy in the span because what we have is all the way down to -112. If you remember in Bitwig, it goes to like -40, and then you really can't see any other readouts on the displays at least. But this is just so you realize like we're going way, way down, well below the range of human hearing, and where this really makes an impact, where it actually makes an audible impact, is when you have more complex signals coming in, not just basically a sine wave with a couple of overtones on the top. So here, when we drive up the gain, no EQ saturation has been applied. Our output stage is linear. When we drive up the gain here, all we're really doing is just bringing up the signal. So again, this should really just be clean gain that's coming in. Again, we're going to see some of those overtones starting to peak up, but they were already a part of the signal. They're just being brought up right now. We're not actually adding anything. We're not really doing anything new to the signal. All right, and we might be distorting a little bit. So let's bring this back down just to be safe, just so you can see what I mean. Then they start to go away again. Okay, now where this gets interesting with this plugin is that we have not only an EQ saturation option, which is going to apply more saturation when you're boosting, but we also can drive the output, and it's basically doing the same thing that this voice gain was doing, or that just drive control was doing. It's going to add in some saturation, and it has a bunch of different modes and a bunch of different ways of doing that. And a lot of the analog plugins have that. The important thing is that you read through the manual and you figure out like what its optimal setting is. So it might say something like, you know, -12 or -14 or something. And that's just telling you that if you go in much quieter than that, if you drive into the plugin at levels below that, you're not expecting to get as much saturation as if you drive in a lot harder. Okay, now this plugin is great because it really makes that clear to you, but in a lot of analog modeled plugins, it's not going to do that. So you kind of have to experiment, and you really have to listen and hear, is this EQ coloring my sound more than just the boost and the EQ is doing? Okay, and some of them, by default, once you boost somewhere, it's going to add some overtones as well. And these things are usually pretty subtle, but just so you guys can see, and this is why gain staging matters so much, is when you start to use plugins and stuff that's modeling more of an analog style amplification. So if we go in here, let's turn EQ saturation on. We're in linear, our calibration is on 0, which basically means that when we drive this out, both because it's set to linear and because our calibration is on 0, we're not really going to expect to do anything too different to what we just saw before when we bring this and drive this all the way up. It shouldn't really look that much different. Now, when I go in, and let's start to add a little bit of gain here as well. All right. And we'll get this close to a true clip. Now when we go in and we start to mess with these settings, we're going to see different things happening. So with the calibrate, if I go on to, let's say, like silky, and I start to bring this calibration to like 18, we should be expecting to see some other stuff start to peak up. Okay, because now this is truly at like its hardest drive setting, especially because we're coming in so hot, and we could come in even harder if we wanted to really try to emphasize that. Okay, and now we can just look at the different modes and how they're going to react. So we have silky, we have mellow, we have deep. Okay, some of these you'll see more of an impact than on others, and we can take this even further down if you really want to see it. Again, this is so far below the range of our hearing, but it will have an impact when you have a really complex signal, not just a sine wave. All right, we have excited. Let's see what that does. It's taking a little while. I have the settings pretty slow to change. Okay. We have toasted. And we have funky. And this is just something to be aware of, right? Like, I don't really care what I'm seeing here. What's more important for you guys to realize is how you're driving into your plugins. How hot is it coming in? How hot is it coming out? When you're working purely with like Bitwig stuff or stuff that's built in, depending on whether or not it has an analog drive component to it, it may not matter at all what the level is you're working at, okay? It may not be coloring the sound in any way, and you can just go in at the end and you can pull this down. Everything will be safe, everything will be well and good. But there's other times where you might be driving in and it may be coloring your sound. So just something to be aware of with your plugins, and something to experiment with too. You know, you may have never known that. You may have always worked at really, really quiet levels until the very end, and then you just boosted everything up with a tool device. This tool device is essentially a clean digital amplifier. That's essentially what it is. It should not be adjusting any of the tonal characteristics, any of the timbral characteristics to our sound. But once you bring in something like this and you have these output stages and you have saturation, that might actually be doing something. And this is true with compressors, it's true with EQs, it's true with all sorts of different plugins, and it's just something to be aware of. So hopefully this video has been helpful for you guys. That whole concept of digital distortion versus analog distortion, maybe that makes a little more sense. And hopefully you can apply that moving forward with your music and music creation. Thanks for watching. Take care.